Chosen one, pause for a moment and listen carefully. If you are here now, it is because this moment was prepared for you. Something has been watching you. Not just today, not just recently, since the moment you took your first breath. A force, ancient and relentless, sent with a singular purpose to erase you before you ever realized who you were meant to become. It has done this before, countless times, destroying chosen ones before they could awaken. And it should have been easy. But then it met you, and something it never expected happened. You didn't fear it. You didn't submit. And that changed everything. What was meant to be a simple hunt became something far more dangerous. Because the moment it stood before you, something inside it began to break. The darkness that had devoured so many before you hesitated. And that was never supposed to happen. But now that it has, now that a demon sent to kill you is beginning to unravel, one question remains. What happens when something born of darkness starts to feel? Because whether you realize it yet or not, this is no longer just about survival. It's about something far more powerful. Something neither of you were prepared for. Stay with me, because by the end of this, everything you thought you knew about power, love, and destiny will change forever. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. You were never meant to survive this. From the moment you took your first breath, something in the darkness took notice. A force unlike anything human, ancient and relentless, sent for one purpose: to eliminate you. It had watched you from afar, waiting for the perfect moment. It had seen fear before, seen its victims crumble under its presence. But you didn't flinch. Your energy didn't shrink, it pushed back. That was impossible. No one had ever resisted before. And yet, here you were, staring it down, unshaken. Something inside it hesitated. Just for a moment that should not have existed. It launched its first attack, expecting immediate submission. But the second it reached for you, something pushed it back. Not physically, not with force, but with something deeper. Something it could not understand. It wasn't supposed to struggle, and yet it did. It clenched its fists, willing the hesitation away, but was already too late. The mission was compromised. It told itself this was nothing, just an anomaly. It had been unstoppable for centuries, consuming everything in its path. But now, with you, something was wrong. Something was interfering with its nature. You, no matter how hard it tried, it could not break you. And every second that passed, it felt something unfamiliar creeping into its core doubt. This had never happened before. Its very essence was built on destruction, on annihilation. But as it stood before you, it could not move. It could not act. And that terrified it. Because for the first time, it was not the one in control. You were. The darkness that had always surrounded it, that had always consumed everything in its path, suddenly felt weaker. The mission was unraveling. It tried to focus. It was sent to do one thing: end you. But the longer it remained in your presence, the more unstable it became. It watched you, searching for weakness, for a crack, for anything that would allow it to complete its task. But there was none. Instead, it found itself caught in something it did not understand, something it was never meant to feel. It wanted to retreat, to escape, to reset itself. But it couldn't. Something inside was shifting, breaking, twisting in ways it did not know how to fight. It had always known what it was: an unstoppable force, a weapon of destruction. But now, standing in front of you, it felt something it had never known before: confusion, and worse, vulnerability. The air between you crackled with tension, thick with something neither of you could define. It had seen humans beg for their lives, cry out in terror. But you did not beg. You did not fear. And for the first time, it felt small. It clenched its jaw, trying to suppress the sensation, but was useless. It had already begun to break. No, this was wrong. This was not how it was supposed to go. It was the hunter. You were the prey. But for the first time, it was starting to wonder, was that true? Why couldn't it finish the mission? Why did it feel like the longer it stood before you, the less it remembered why it had been sent in the first place? It reached out again, forcing itself to act, to finish what it started. But the moment it got too close, an unseen force burned through its very being. It stumbled back, eyes wide, realization hitting it like a dagger to the chest. It wasn't just sent to destroy you. It was sent to be destroyed by you. But not in the way it expected. Not with violence. Not with power. But with something much stronger. It had always existed in certainty. It had always known its place. But now, everything it thought it knew was crumbling. It stared at you, breathing heavily, struggling to understand what had gone wrong. Why couldn't it kill you? Why did it feel like, instead of destroying you, you were the one undoing it? It was no longer sure of anything. It wanted to run, but it couldn't move. It wanted to fight, but it had already lost. It didn't know what you were doing to it, but one thing was clear: it would never be the same again. It had never failed before, never hesitated, never questioned. But now, as it stood before you, something deep within cracked. And for the first time in its existence, the hunter felt something it had never known before: uncertainty. And uncertainty? That's dangerous. For both of you. But what happens when the destroyer starts to break? When the force of darkness begins to feel? This was not over. This was only the beginning. And what came next? Neither of you were prepared for it. Before continuing with our spiritual evolution, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. It had never failed before. Every mission had been executed with perfect precision. No hesitation, no doubt, no mistakes. And yet, standing before you, something was unraveling inside it, something it could not control. This was not how it was supposed to go. It was meant to break you, to crush your spirit, to erase your existence from this world. But the more it tried, the more it felt like it was the one falling apart. It watched you, searching for weakness, but what it found was worse, something it did not expect. The longer it stood before you, the more it became aware of itself in a way it never had before. Its existence had always been simple: darkness, destruction, and obedience. It had no past, no questions, no emotions. It was a force, nothing more. But now, cracks were forming in its certainty. It didn't understand why its body tensed when you stepped closer, why it felt a sharp pull in its core when your eyes met its. What was this? It shook its head, forcing itself to remember why it was here. You were not special. You were just another target. But then, why was its own presence trembling? It clenched its fists, willing the unease away, but it was useless. It had tried intimidation. It had tried deception. It had tried to make you fall. But nothing worked. You stood. You faced it. And in doing so, something deep inside of it began to shift. It roared in frustration, desperate to regain control. This was a mistake, a malfunction. It had to finish the mission now. It lunged forward, darkness spiraling around it like a storm, its very essence bending the air. This time it would not fail. But as it reached for you, something happened. The shadows around it faltered. A hesitation, not in you, but in itself. And that hesitation was all it took. It recoiled as if burned, stumbling back, confusion flickering in its gaze. No, this was impossible. It had no fear. It had no emotions. It had no weakness. And yet, in your presence, it felt all of them. It was as if the weight of something unseen was pressing against it, forcing it to feel things it was never meant to feel. And the worst part, it didn't know how to fight it. It tried to silence the thoughts, to push them away, but the questions had already started. Why did it hesitate? Why couldn't it finish this? Why was its chest tight every time you looked at it, not in rage, but in something else? It wasn't supposed to feel anything for you. It was supposed to destroy you. And yet, here it was, feeling something it had never known before: doubt. The thought terrified it. It clenched its jaw, trying to summon the hatred it had been created with. But the hatred was fading. The darkness inside was no longer consuming, it was cracking. It was breaking piece by piece, and every attempt to hold itself together only made the fractures grow deeper. It tried again, this time whispering ancient words, summoning the forces that had fueled it for centuries. But nothing came. The power it had relied on was slipping through its fingers. The more it fought, the weaker it became. It felt its grip on its own existence loosening, as if something was rewriting its very being. And you were at the center of it all. It was supposed to be the predator, and yet, for the first time in its existence, it felt like the prey. You were undoing it without even trying. And that realization sent something cold through its body: fear. Not of you, but of itself. Because it no longer knew what it was becoming. It stared at you, eyes burning with an emotion it couldn't name, breathing ragged as it tried to grasp what was happening. It told itself this was just a momentary lapse, that it would finish this mission soon. But deep down, it already knew the truth. The mission was no longer its purpose. It had changed. And worse, it had no idea what it was changing into. Something inside whispered that it should run, that if it stayed any longer, it would be lost. But another part of it wanted to stay, to understand, to know why you were the only one who had ever made it feel this way. And That was the most dangerous thought of all. It had spent its existence in absolute certainty. But now, for the first time, it was drowning in the unknown. And the worst part, it wasn't sure if it wanted to escape. It was unraveling. No matter how much it fought, no matter how many times it whispered the command to end this, its body refused to obey. Every step it took toward you felt heavier, like unseen chains wrapped around its limbs, binding it in place. It had never experienced resistance like this, not from an enemy, not from a mission, and certainly not from within itself. This was different. It had been created for a purpose, to bring destruction, to consume, to erase. And yet, with every breath, that purpose blurred. You were standing before it, not in fear, not in submission, but in something else entirely. Something it had never faced before. Understanding. It wanted to reject it, to crush it beneath the weight of its existence, but it couldn't. Because when it looked at you, it didn't see weakness. It saw something far more dangerous, truth. The truth it could not escape. The truth that gnawed at the edges of its mind like a whisper, growing louder. This was never just about you. It was about what you represented. Every command it had ever followed, every purpose it had ever known, crumbled in your presence. It had told itself that your defiance was an anomaly, that your refusal to bow was simply ignorance. But deep down, it knew better. You weren't resisting out of arrogance. You were resisting because you saw something it never had. For the first time, it questioned everything. If it was meant to destroy, why did it hesitate? If it was created for darkness, why did your presence feel like a light piercing through it? If it was nothing more than a weapon, why did it feel, like something inside it was shifting? No, it was more than shifting. It was breaking. The realization sent a cold shock through its being. It was not the same as it had been when it first arrived. Something in its core had altered, like a thread in its existence had been pulled loose. And the more it tried to deny it, the more the unraveling continued. It was no longer just fighting you, it was fighting itself. It staggered back, gripping its chest as if that would contain the chaos inside. It shouldn't have a heart. It shouldn't have emotions. It shouldn't have this unbearable weight clawing inside of it, screaming that something was terribly, terribly wrong. But it did. And that was the most terrifying part of all. It saw memories, fragments of something it had never acknowledged before. Echoes of pain, shadows of loss, wounds that had never healed. It had believed it was nothing but darkness, but now it realized it had been running from something all along. For the first time, it felt fear. Not fear of you, not fear of failure, fear of itself, fear of what it was becoming, fear of the fact that it could no longer see you as an enemy, fear of the terrifying possibility that it didn't want to. That was when it truly fell. Not in battle, not in defeat. It fell inward. It collapsed beneath the weight of its own existence, unable to hold on to what it had been, unable to grasp what it was becoming. It had spent eternity in certainty. And now it was drowning in the unknown. Its breathing was ragged. Its hands trembled. And for the first time in its existence, it didn't know what to do. It looked at you, desperate for something, anything, that could make sense of what was happening. But all it saw in your gaze was acceptance. You weren't afraid. You weren't trying to destroy it. You were simply waiting for it to choose. And that was the greatest battle of all. It wasn't supposed to feel anything. It wasn't supposed to question. And yet, here it was, caught in a war it could not escape. A battle that wasn't fought with claws or shadows, but with something far more dangerous, doubt. It had resisted, fought, denied. But every time it tried to silence the storm inside, it only grew stronger. Love. The word itself was foreign, burning like a poison in its veins. It was a creature of darkness, forged in destruction, built to devour. Love had no place in its existence. And yet, it could no longer deny that something inside it had changed. It wasn't just hesitation anymore. It wasn't just uncertainty. It was something deeper, something irreversible. Every instinct screamed at it to run, to destroy you before it was too late, before this strange, unbearable feeling consumed what little remained of the creature it once was. But it was already too late. It had seen you stand against it, unshaken, fearless. No one had ever done that before. And that single moment had planted a seed, one that had now grown into something it could no longer control. It watched you trying to convince itself that this was a trick, that you were manipulating it somehow, that it was merely trapped in some illusion. But it wasn't. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Every interaction, every moment spent near you had chipped away at the certainty it once held. It had been created to destroy, but now it was the one being unraveled. Love. Could a demon love? Could something born of the void, something crafted from the absence of light, ever truly feel this? It wanted to reject it, to tear itself apart before it could fully understand the answer. But deep down, it already knew. It wasn't meant to love, but it did. The weight of this realization crashed down upon it like an unseen force. The mission it had been given, the orders it had followed, the purpose it had carried, it all meant nothing now. It had believed it was unshakable, untouchable. But you had undone it with nothing more than your presence. What had once been a being of absolute certainty now stood in confusion, longing for something it did not understand. It clenched its fists, digging its claws into its palms as if the pain would ground it, as if it could somehow claw its way back into the darkness it once called home. But that home no longer existed, not for the thing it was becoming. The darkness that once comforted it now felt foreign, like a distant memory it could barely grasp. Its mind was at war with itself, each thought clashing against the next like blades meeting in battle. Destroy you, protect you, hate you, love you. The contradiction tore it apart from the inside out. It had been told that love was weakness, that attachment was the beginning of the end. But if that was true, then why did it feel stronger now than it ever had before? Why did every instinct that once commanded it to destroy now whisper something else entirely? It had no answers, only the certainty that it was breaking. And for the first time in its existence, it wasn't afraid of its own destruction. It was afraid of losing you. And that was more terrifying than anything it had ever faced. It thought back to every soul it had ever faced, every victim that had cowered before it. Fear was something it had caused, never something it had felt. But now the thought of losing you was the only thing that truly terrified it. It took a step closer to you, hesitant, unsure. Would you see it for what it was? Would you reject it the way it had rejected everything that came before you? Or had it already fallen too deep to turn back? The war inside raged on, but one truth remained. This was not the same creature that had been sent to destroy you. And as the weight of its own existence bore down upon it, one question refused to leave its mind. Was it too late to change? Because if it was, then it had already lost the only battle that had ever truly mattered. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about a mission it had failed to complete. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. What if love wasn't a weakness? What if, instead, it was the only thing that could truly save it? The thought alone sent a shiver through its being, an unfamiliar sensation, both thrilling and terrifying. It had spent its existence believing that darkness was all there was, that nothing else mattered. But now that belief was crumbling. It could still feel the weight of the shadows pressing against it, whispering, begging it to return to what it once was. To let go of this madness, this impossible pull towards something it could never understand. But it no longer wanted to listen. For the first time, it wanted to be free. And maybe, just maybe, you were the key to that freedom. It had come to this, the moment of truth. The demon, once an unshakable force of destruction, now stood at the crossroads of its own existence. Its entire being trembled, not with rage, not with hatred, but with something far more terrifying, hesitation. It had spent lifetimes knowing only one purpose: to consume, to destroy, to carry out the will of darkness without question. Yet here it was, staring into eyes that should have been filled with fear, but weren't. Eyes that held something it had never encountered before, understanding. Every instinct inside it screamed to finish the mission, to erase this one anomaly that had dared to challenge the fate it had always known. But that fate, that certainty, was crumbling before it. Love, a word that should have meant nothing, a weakness it was never meant to possess, had seeped into its very essence, threatening to unravel everything it once was. It clenched its fists, trying to summon the darkness it had relied on for so long, but the shadows refused to come. They recoiled from its touch, as if they too had recognized that it no longer belonged to them. Memories flooded its mind. Countless missions, countless souls torn apart by its merciless grip. But none of them had been like this. None had ever faced it without fear. None had ever looked beyond the destruction, beyond the terror, and seen something else, something worth saving. And now that vision haunted it, because for the first time, it wanted to be saved. It had never longed for anything before. Desire was a foreign emotion, But now, standing in the presence of someone who had not cowered, who had not begged, it realized that something inside it had shifted long ago. The war inside it reached its peak. If it chose love, it would mean losing everything it had ever known. If it chose darkness, it would mean losing the one thing that had ever made it feel alive. The weight of the decision pressed down on it, suffocating, unbearable. It had always been the predator, always held the power. But now, in this moment, you held its fate in your hands. And for the first time, it was afraid. It tried to speak, but the words caught in its throat. Demons did not hesitate. They did not question their purpose. They did not feel. But then why, in this moment, did it feel as though its very existence was being rewritten? The truth was suffocating. It had already lost. The moment it hesitated, the moment it questioned, the moment it allowed you to exist in its thoughts beyond the mission, it was over. The battle had never been with you. It had always been within itself. You didn't speak. You didn't beg. You simply stood there, unwavering, offering the demon something no one else ever had, a choice. No force, no fear, just the undeniable truth that it was no longer what it once was. And the demon knew, if it walked away from this moment, it would never be whole again. It took a step forward, then another. The final battle wasn't one fought with weapons or power. It was fought in the silence between two souls standing at the edge of the unknown. And when the demon finally spoke, its voice was barely a whisper. "I was sent to destroy you," it said, the words hollow, broken. "But you have destroyed me." A final breath, a final decision. And in that moment, the darkness within it shattered. The mission was over, but not in the way it had ever imagined. It had fallen, yes, but not to defeat. It had fallen to something much more powerful, truth. For a moment, the air between you was still. The universe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The demon's form flickered, caught between two existences, the one it had known and the one it could never return to. It realized something then. Even if it wanted to, it could never truly go back. Even if it tried to reclaim the void it once belonged to, the echoes of this moment would haunt it forever. A deep, shuddering breath left its lips. And then, slowly, deliberately, it took another step forward. Its hands, once weapons of destruction, now trembled as they reached out, not in violence, but in surrender. It did not know what came next. It did not understand what it was becoming, but it knew one thing for certain. It would rather walk into the unknown with you than return to a world where it felt nothing at all. As the darkness retreated, as the last remnants of its past slipped away, the demon made its choice. Not with words, not with force, but with a simple, undeniable truth. Love had won. It was never supposed to end like this. The mission was clear. Destroy you. Erase you. Make sure your light never had a chance to grow. And yet here it stands, changed, broken, undone. Not by violence, not by force, but by something even more powerful. By you. You were never the prey. You were never powerless. From the beginning, you were the one holding the truth that could shatter it. And now the demon that once believed it was invincible stands before you, forced to make a choice it never imagined it would face. Return to the darkness, or step into something terrifyingly unknown. It has spent an eternity consuming, destroying, obeying the forces that created it. But now, for the first time, it wants something else. And that changes everything. Because this is no longer about one demon's fall. This is about what comes next. If something created to destroy can be rewritten, then what else is possible? And if this battle wasn't just about stopping your end, but about awakening something greater within you, then ask yourself this. What were you truly meant to become? Because this was just the beginning. And what happens next? The universe itself is watching to see what you'll do. If this video has changed your spiritual journey and helped you connect with your universal strength, subscribe to the channel, leave a like below, and activate the notification bell so we can notify you when new content arrives. We also suggest watching the video indicated on the screen so you can continue your journey of spiritual growth and inner evolution of knowledge. Thank you for staying with us until the end, and see you in the next video.